Hello world, I'm Joanne with the Frizzle Factor, and today I wanted to talk about how to make science matter. And specifically with this episode, I wanted to dive deep into how we can build empathy through history in the science classroom. One of the things that I'm really excited about in this endeavor, and as a teacher who is going into the workforce, is that I really want to explore ways of making science relevant and also showing how other subjects can bridge into the science classroom. I think sometimes it can be a little scary to know how, as teachers in the science classroom, that we can integrate things like literacy and other things like art and history into our class. We're often told that we need to integrate literacy, but sometimes it can be hard to know how. And this, I think, is a very simple, impactful way that we can. Hopefully you will find that too. So one thing that I really like to do that is kind of a staple practice is allowing students to read. Yes, read, even in the science classroom. One of the best ways to build literacy is to just read and read with students, talk with one another, and to think through ideas. And so one thing that I created was a tic-tac-toe choice board that is meant to be reading responses towards reading text, but also can be responses towards podcasts, because we can develop literacy not just through reading, but also through communication and also thinking about the academic language that we want to bring about. And so I have this choice board that allows students to choose, 3 things: across, diagonal, up and down, in response to various topics. And so I have used this with certain podcasts and with reading. And one of the things that I use this with is a book that I loved. I actually was exposed to it in my undergraduate before I came to be a biology major. I had a professor in a modern China and Japan class that I took who actually had this as our class textbook for the semester. And the book that we read was Mao's War Against Nature by Judith Shapiro. Now, don't be scared. It is a little bit of an academic work because she does go into a lot of the details of what happened during Maoist China and the Communist Revolution, and some of the things that happened during periods of the Great Leap Forward, and particularly in the Four Pest Campaign. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that happened in this period of history. So, for example, people were filling whole lakes in with their hands. And this was something that people did. People were, school children went out and killed sparrows during school in order to get some money and to contribute to the efforts at home. There were situations where teenagers would go out and it was almost like they were going out to war, but instead of fighting other people, they were cutting down rubber trees. There's a lot of really fascinating case studies of what happened during the Great Leap Forward, and a lot of it deals with the environmental impact that humans had during this relatively short period of time in history, and how China has kind of been rebounding from that since. I will say, I think it goes up towards the 90s, maybe the early 2000s, and so I would definitely be interested to learn more about some of those impacts even now that it's been several decades later since the book came out. But it's a very fascinating book, and it has some very just heart-wrenching primary sources, interviews with people talking about their experiences as even children, going through some of these events like killing rats and killing birds and having to stay out really late cutting down trees or smelting metal. And it's very fascinating to hear and see, and I think even a little scary and jarring to read stories about, the foxes disappearing in the forest. And I remember when they used to play and they no longer play, or 1,000-year-old trees being cut down and used, or just the stories of the people going out and killing the sparrows. And so I find this to be an amazing case study that people can use to talk about human impact. And I would definitely recommend this for every high school classroom that goes over this in environmental science or in environmental and human impact topics in biology class. But I can also see that this can be adapted to a middle school classroom. I think that as a teacher, you can curate which pieces you would like, because like I said, there's some sections that are more primary source-like, where the author takes interviews and talking with people that you could break down. And then there are also more narrative portions where she actually describes some of the events that are happening. And so what I would do, and what I have done in trying to practice this, is I've used this choice board with this work. And what I would do, and will do, certainly, with my classroom is, depending on their grade levels, I will curate kind of which sections I want them to be able to read. And what I like to do is have groups where it's kind of topical. So I would have a group that's just focused on the 4-Pest campaign, so maybe about the sparrows being killed. And then I would have another group maybe focused on the rubber tree and cutting down and all of that kind of entailed. And then I would have maybe another group focused on maybe some of the water impacts, and there's a whole section talking about some of the work that was done on lakes and some of the geological damage that was done. And then I would maybe have one maybe even just focused on the cultural aspects of like why they were doing this and what is going on, and some of the maybe mentality that went into mobilizing an entire country against nature, as the book implies. And so I section off, each group would have a topic, but each person would have kind of a short snippet that goes with everyone else. So this is especially helpful for classrooms where you don't have necessarily strong readers. You can assure them, look, you're just reading a small section and just kind of giving your initial thoughts. Do your best. There might be some challenging words or names, but what you're really trying to get at is the heart and kind of the message of what's being done. You can predict, just like we would predict with certain evidence that we get in science, what might be being talked about in this passage. And so as a group, they would each individually read, respond with their tic-tac-toe choice board, or again, if you want to simplify it, you can easily just make it a simple think, pair, share, or an I see, I think, I wonder. There are different ways that you can adapt this to your own classroom's needs. And then I would have the group share with each other, because that's when things start going off, the light bulbs start lighting up, because you start to realize, oh, okay, this is a weird thing that's happening. All these school children are going out and they're like killing these sparrows, and they might be maybe talking about that and thinking like, oh, they might be asking, Mrs. Wasden, did this really happen? And I'd be like, yes, it really happened. So this might be when they're starting to get curious and starting to maybe get a holistic picture of what's happening. Then I like to bring it together for a more classroom discussion. So this is really helpful. Something that you might want to train your students to be able to do at the beginning of the year is being able to have these more long-form discussions with each other. So you might encourage them with Socratic seminars. You might have to practice using some I don't know, maybe like a token where, hold the ball and you're the one talking kind of practices. Depends on your needs and your style. But I really am a fan of being discussion based and trying to get to the heart, because I do think that this is a way that we can build literacy and empathy. But anyway, and so I would talk about that. And then I also like to include propaganda posters to kind of get them like, oh, what is this about? And thinking about that. And then it all kind of comes together. I will provide a lesson plan so you can see a little bit of how I would do this. But again, adapt it to your own. I think this is a wonderful case study that really gets to the heart of what people are really capable of, both positively and negatively. I think there's a lot of interesting things during this period of history, and I think it's just something that people don't really realize happened. And I would like to just raise more awareness. I myself struggled finding resources on it. I would love to have more of a documentary. I'd love to have more resources on it. But it's something that maybe not a lot of Westerners especially are maybe cognizant of in our world history. And I think it's just so fascinating, and every environmental science teacher needs to read it. And secondly, another literacy-based but also empathy-building case study in history is looking at the Spanish flu. So we're going from environmental science to actually, in some ways, the Spanish flu could also impact the environment. And we did learn a little bit about that. So flu is something that can be talked about when thinking about limiting factors if you're on that topic. And this is actually context in which I talked about disease, and flu is talking about limiting factors. But I really wanted to show kind of the context and the human aspect of it. And so I got a lot of primary sources. There are plenty of primary sources available free online that are primary sources, newspaper clippings, records, etc., of the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. And it is, or I should say really pandemic, it is very fascinating and interesting to read. It's also very sad, and I know it can be really heavy, but that's one thing that I really love about middle schoolers especially, is that they can go from laughing to crying in one moment, because they really understand kind of the flexibility of our emotions. But even with high school students, I think this is really impactful to think about, because people their age were impacted. There's different clippings that I've read about students that canceled their prom because everyone was dying from the Spanish flu, so they couldn't meet up, actually. There were people that had to there are whole excerpts. There's this really sad one about building children's coffins, or there's one about how several cities, such as in really congested areas like New York City, ended up having to basically ship off a lot of the sick people. And so there's lots of really horrifying stories of orphans just kind of being on trains and not really having a place to go because people were so scared about being contaminated. And a lot of them were basically considered dead anyway because it happened so quickly and it was very unlikely that they would survive. So there's a lot of really fascinating sources that you can read, and this is another one where I would again divide it up. I did a sort of I see, I think, I wonder. So I did a think, pair, share that kind of went through, had students think about it on their own, and with their I see, I think, I wonder, I had them also sort those into greater categories. So one I had like the impact. The impact on the environment. I think I had one that's talking about like human impact, like maybe on the economics or social. I had one that talked about, I think, like the disease specifically, so more on the medical side. So I had a few different topics that I wanted them to think about when approaching this topic, and I had them sort their post-it notes of their I thinks, I see, I wonder on their excerpts with those. So it was an interesting way to introduce an idea and talk more about the impacts of disease, and especially how the flu impacted us. And it's a little bit of some ways that you can build empathy. Again, just looking at history and just finding a way to integrate it into your classroom, because it's helpful, because we don't want to forget these things, because as scientists, it's important that we come out of a history. We're coming out of a long history of people who have been observing and interacting with the world around them. And so it's important that we don't forget that. So that's kind of it, I guess. Those are my two case studies that I think would be great, easy examples to put into your biology or life science classroom, environmental science classroom. So Mao's War Against Nature by Judith Shapiro focused on the Great Leap Forward and the Four Pests campaign, and also thinking about the Spanish flu and using primary sources from that. You can kind of make your class a little bit of a history class for the day, but it helps to set the stage really well when diving deep into the science, because you can see the human element in both of these examples. So let me know if you have other periods in history that you think would be interesting to focus on in a biology or life science classroom. I would be really interested in hearing them. If you have more resources on the Great Leap Forward and other aspects of Mao's China, that would be great too, because I just soak that up. I love that period in history. It's just an interesting, fascinating case study. And also, if you have any other ideas for things you would like me to talk about or address, ask me questions. Feel free to visit my website and or post a comment below, and I'll try to get back to you. So have a good day. Build empathy through history and literacy at the same time. So, woo!